Hello, I'm Rebecca Robertson, President and Executive Producer of Park Avenue Armory. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth virtual Malkin Lecture for 2020, entitled Playing with the Varsity, Stanford White and Lewis Comfort Tiffany at the Gould Memorial Library. This is the fourth talk in a series of 5 free lectures by noted historians and curators. And if you missed any of the lectures so far, the email you received about this talk contains links to the others as well. Our speaker tonight is Sam White, a leading expert in the life and work of his great-grandfather, Stanford White, and a founder and consulting partner at PBDW Architects, the executive architects for the Armory's ongoing renovation and restoration. He is also the author and co-author with Elizabeth White of numerous books on Stanford White and the firm of McKim White, including his just-published book, Stanford White in Detail. In this video, Sam is speaking on the Gould Memorial Library, a collaborative project by White with Lewis Comfort Tiffany. Thus, it is very fitting that Sam's talk is filmed in the Armory's Veterans Room, a work by Tiffany and White executed 15 years prior to the Gould Library. I hope you enjoyed this and the other Malkin Lecture videos this fall. Please take care. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for that introduction, and welcome to the Armory, ladies and gentlemen, me in person and you virtually. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be associated with the Armory. Well, this is the story of Gould Memorial Library. Gould is the last surviving major public building designed by Stanford White. It was constructed originally for New York University, and it is now occupied by the Bronx Community College. Gould is important for a number of reasons, not just because it's the last of its kind, but because it's a great work of architecture. It's one that emerged from a collaboration of a visionary educator, 2 brilliant artists, and a generous donor. Now, collaborations in architecture can sometimes be a messy business, and Gould is no exception. Even when the process is linear, it has a few bumps and even a few surprises, and in Gould's case, one of the surprises includes a cameo appearance on the silver screen, which we'll see later. Well, the visionary educator was Henry McCracken. You see him here, the chancellor of what was then called City University of New York. McCracken's ambition was to transform what had been a relatively small urban university into a large research university on the model of German research universities that was popular at the time. And to do this, McCracken realized that he couldn't do it where he was, which was down in Greenwich Village in 1 or 2 buildings around Washington Square. So he looked for some land, and he found a piece of property up in the Bronx called the Molly Estate, 40 acres for sale, and he bought it. And this is a photograph showing the Molly Estate view looking west at about the time that McCracken bought this property. You can see the Harlem River in the foreground. You see Upper Manhattan with the Broadway Bridge in the middle ground, and then in the distance you see the little slice of the Hudson River and the New Jersey Palisades. Well, McCracken not only wanted to move the institution 14 miles to the north, he also wanted to move its principal building. This was the main building designed in 1833 by Town and Davis, and it was much beloved, and McCracken felt as though this was an important bit of continuity. Someone created this rendering showing what the campus would look like if the main building was moved up and used as the seed pearl for the creation of a new campus. And it shows that it sort of forecloses the choice of styles. I mean, once you start with Gothic, you go Gothic. But the more serious issue was that McCracken discovered that the cost of moving the main building stone by stone up to the Bronx and rebuilding it in what was now called University Heights was the equivalent of the cost of 5 new buildings, and that McCracken could not justify. So he switched and came up with the idea of an architectural competition. He contacted some of the leading architects in New York, and in the McCracken files at NYU, there's this quite wonderful letter from George B. Post. Post says that he had gone to the university, and so he feels strongly about the institution, that a library is a much more interesting architectural problem than most of the problems of classroom buildings. And he further says that he would be happy to participate in a competition, but McCracken has to realize that he's going to have to pay the competitors that Post didn't want McCracken to get any free architectural services, even at the competition stage. And then he finishes up by saying that he completely agrees with Stanford White in his judgment that in terms of the architecture of campus buildings, the style should be severely classical. Well, Stanford White enters the picture at this point, and he does so for a number of reasons. By the mid-1890s, Stanford White was the most visible architect in New York. A few years earlier, he had finished the Madison Square Garden, the building that really transformed not only the streetscape and the skyline of New York City, but also people's expectations of what a public building might be like. White had another qualification, which was that he may have gotten into the competition the old-fashioned way. White's father, Richard Grant White, had gone to NYU 40 years earlier and had been class marshal. He was well connected with the NYU administration, and it's possible that Richard Grant White put a plug in for his little boy. White, however, belonged in this crowd, that the firm McKim, Mead & White was the largest and most famous architecture firm in the country at that time. They had finished their work at the World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago in 1893, and McKim had finished the Boston Public Library, much celebrated and open. So they had not only the reputation, but the qualifications for the project itself. Now, when you do a library, there are two essentially formal paradigms. One is the Basilica plan, which is what the Boston Public Library uses, and the other is the Rotunda. And McKim, Mead & White came up with the Rotunda plan for New York University's library. You can see it here with that circle of columns enclosing a reading room. There's a layer of open stacks around it for reference books, and then closed stacks beyond that for books that you would have to put a call slip in for. And then in addition to the reading room itself, there were some administrative offices and a great staircase leading up to it. Well, this plan really begs what the interior would be like, and the interior certainly fulfilled the expectations of the plan. You have these great circle of columns supporting an attic story, and all under this magnificent dome. This photograph was taken right after the library opened, and if you count it up, you can see about 90 readers' desks. This was a fatal flaw in this library design. 90 desks was far too few to readers to accommodate for a university on a par with McCracken's ambitions, but this was what he wanted and this was what he got. It looks like this today. The books are not in those shelves. The reference books have gone, but the rest of the building is really, particularly the interior of this portion, is very much intact as it was over 100 years ago. Obviously, White was looking closely at the Pantheon in Rome when he was designing this. It's the same partie. And White may have been looking at the Pantheon a little too literally at the beginning, because if you look at the square coffers in the dome, those show up in what I would call the design development drawings for the library here at NYU. But White had an ability to use elements as placeholders and then change it after he had thought about it for a while. And he clearly thought about this and possibly inspired by the chapel at the Château d'Anet in France, the building built for Diane de Poitiers. He switched to this spiral coffering, and that is what he built, and that's what gives this interior this sort of incredible sense of movement and energy. Well, libraries were pretty new things in the world of university design, and so they're feeling their way through. 150 years ago, the libraries simply consisted of the reading room. Now there was more that had to be accommodated. So this shows, for example, the light blue is the reading room that we saw earlier. The darker blue are the reserve books, and then the closed stacks. The very darkest blue are the special collections, such as government documents and maps. And then this also had a second function. In addition to being a library, it was the sort of the administrative headquarters of the university, so that those spaces in brown were where McCracken had his office. And things have really changed since McCracken did NYU. He probably had one or two secretaries and a couple of people doing the bookkeeping downstairs. Now, I understand a typical university has as many administrators as it has faculty. Well, in addition to being a library and an office building, it was also a lecture hall and chapel. The whole thing sat on top of this 600-seat auditorium, which you see here in a contemporary photograph. It was used probably principally for large lectures, which were the sort of irreducible unit of undergraduate education at that time. But I think on Sundays it was probably used for compulsory religious services. McCracken was a Presbyterian minister, and that arrangement of chairs certainly looks like a meeting of the elders. Well, it looks like this today. It was restored about 20 years ago by my firm following many decades of misadventures that we will go into. And in addition to having a library and administrative offices and an auditorium / lecture hall, there was a fourth component to this building, which was off to the side. It was a museum, and it looked like this at the time. This was built to house the university's collection of very large paintings in very heavy frames. And whether the paintings were any good or not, I don't know. I haven't done that research. But my favorite object in this museum is in the foreground there. It's a gigantic lump of South Sea coral, which I understand is still up on the campus today. Well, the plan and section and elevation of this obviously can be traced back to the Pantheon. It's interesting that architects who used the Pantheon as this kind of jumping off point for designs looked at the Pantheon in different ways, and they took a different lesson from it. For example, when McKim, who was doing the library for Columbia University at precisely the same time that White was doing the NYU library, when McKim looked at this, he saw the Pantheon as a very urban structure that was a wall almost that was closing off a tightly framed urban space. And he wasn't that interested in the pediment as he was interested in the large number of columns. And that's exactly what he used when he did the Low Library at Columbia University. White, on the other hand, looked at the Pantheon really through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson saw the Pantheon not as this urban structure, but almost as a semi-rural structure, an object that would hold its place in space by virtue of its sort of jewel-like foreground appearance rather than any great massive wall. And using that model, White designed the elevations of the Memorial Library, which you see here. White's library has broader shoulders than Jefferson's, and that's because White had to accommodate a fair amount of stack space. When Jefferson did his library, books were quite rare. When they put in enough stack space, they were convinced to last 100 years. Well, it lasted about 15 or 20 years. Nobody could predict the number of books that were starting to be issued. And White, in addition to sort of taking Jefferson's point of view, added his own sort of special Stanford White cocktail, which was this sort of saturation of very densely textured ornament that you see the chenaux and the pediment and the cornices, the scalloped shingles look like fish scales on the dome, and then that variegated Roman brick. This is what makes this building sing. Well, having completed the design of the building, White turned to the master plan for the university itself. And it developed that there were essentially two different approaches to the master plan. And in all cases, the library was at the western edge of the campus. But the question was how to deal with what was called the Ohio field, a playing field and running track that had been given to the university by a group of Ohio alumni and who not only wanted the element incorporated into the campus, but wanted that name attached to it. And the choice was, on the left, the field is running north-south, and on the right, the field is running east-west. And there was a reason for each of these, that when you ran it north-south, you effectively sealed off the academic quadrangle. And White argued that that was important because while the campus was surrounded by essentially open fields at the time, he knew the city would grow up around it and that the space of that academic quadrangle would become more and more important. But he was interested in the scheme in which it was oriented east-west, and McCracken was particularly interested in that because it made for very easy connections between the academic precinct of the campus and the residential precinct at the top, and particularly because there was a building already in place for the residential precinct, a dormitory that had been given to NYU by the Gould family and designed by McKim, Mead, and White. Well, there is another letter in which White says he'll do anything McCracken wants, but he really does recommend the north-south orientation, and the plan on the right shows the approved master plan for the campus. It also shows the 5 buildings that Stanford White designed for that campus, but it's remarkable because it's only 5. White died in 1906. He never got another chance to do another building there, and the campus development, I think, went on, pretty much abandoned a lot of White's master planning. McKim fared much better at Columbia, where he not only did the master plan, did the main library in the center, designed most of the buildings around it, and even those buildings that he did not design, or the firm did not design, followed the architectural vocabulary of the McKim, Mead, and White design for Columbia. Well, with the building designed and with the campus planned out, there was one more piece to put in place, and that was to get the money. It was the job of the university president then, as it is today, to ultimately find somebody who is going to write the check. The first person that was contacted was a man named Charles Flint. You see him on the right. Flint was the head of a company that later became the International Business Machines Corporation. So he was a savvy and successful businessman, and it's said that in sort of philanthropy or fundraising circles, that if you ask somebody for money, they'll give you advice, and if you ask them for advice, they'll give you advice and they might give you money. Flint writes a letter back to McCracken in which he gives him a lot of advice, so you can draw your own conclusions about what was asked. But it's not bad advice. He first of all says that he's reviewed the plans, he thinks they're good. He has attached a list of builders that he believes would be appropriate for the commission. And lastly, he suggests that if McCracken is looking for somebody to pay for this, that he contact Andrew Carnegie. Well, not a bad suggestion. Carnegie certainly had the wherewithal, he had the record of philanthropy, but there is no record that McCracken ever did contact Carnegie, and there's certainly no record that Carnegie ever responded favorably, because if he had, there would be a building up there with Carnegie's name on it. That was pretty much his habit. So McCracken has to kind of go back to his Rolodex and look at home team sources for this, and the most home team was a man named Jay Gould. Jay Gould was the great railroad consolidator of the late 19th century. Some people said he was the great scoundrel of the late 19th century because he was able to consolidate these railroads essentially by diluting the stock. At any rate, he made a lot of money, and he was exceptionally generous to Henry McCracken. He gave some, possibly all, of the money that McCracken needed to buy the Molly estate, and the family had given the money to build that dormitory that you just saw. And there was just one problem here, which was that by the time McCracken was ready to go out and fundraise for the new library, Jay Gould was no longer in the land of the living. But he had children, and his daughter, Helen, had inherited the money with her brothers. She was a philanthropist. She was extremely generous, and she had one further qualification, which was that she was the first woman to have graduated from NYU's law school. So she felt a tremendous loyalty towards the institution. She looked over the plans, and she essentially signed up for camp. She said that she would be happy to pay for this building as a tribute to her father. So now the plans are in place, the money's in place, and the next document you find in the McCracken archives is the invitation to the groundbreaking, dated October 19th, 1895. And you see 3 buildings here. All 3 buildings are very close to each other, all 3 buildings designed by Stanford White, but we're talking about the library that is right in the middle. Well, the first building or first part to get under construction was the museum that you saw earlier. And that is built, and that would create this sort of C shape that the library would sort of nestle into. And it was probably programmatically required, but it was also visually required to make the library look as though it wasn't sliding down the hill into the Harlem River. The Gould family was quite organized, and on top of this, here's a letter from Frank J. Gould, who was the secretary of the Special Building Committee, accepting a bid for building that museum. It's $57,900, and they approve the bids, they pay the bills, and the project is off to the races. And you can see that this building is being built in the middle of a kind of a vast wasteland. But it's a start. And what happens here is that the relationship between McCracken and Stanford White starts to evolve as the building goes into construction. The different sides of their personalities come out. So there are a number of letters suggesting this. One is from Stanford White to McCracken, in which Stanford White is basically rapping McCracken's knuckles for sort of talking directly to the contractor and proposing changes. I think McCracken was probably a bit of a micromanager, and he came by that honestly, because think of what he had done himself in bringing this university sort of up to the level that it is today. That all started with McCracken, but Stanford White is pointing out that for the chain of communication to go from the owner to the contractor to the architect was an invitation to chaos. White is really trying to defend the kind of the protocols of the architectural profession. There's another letter in which Stanford White acknowledges that McCracken has asked to cut $100,000 out of the budget. That would have been approximately 10% of the cost of the building. White says this is not easy to do, particularly if you want cut stone, but he thinks he has found a way to do it and to preserve the quality of the design. Here, the building is now up, the shell is up, the interiors are not in, the windows are not in. You can see the museum off to the left, and you also see this sort of strange object up at the top of the building. And what that was a mock-up of a winged Victory. This is something that McCracken wanted on top of the building. He had budgeted $15,000 to hire Frederick McMonnies to produce this statue. White was very much against it, persuaded McCracken to at least do a mock-up of it. And on the basis of the mock-up, White argued that the statue on the roof of the building interfered with the kind of horizontal repose and continuity of the buildings on the campus. And whether this was a specious argument or not, it seemed to carry the day. I suspect that McCracken was just as happy to be able to spend the $15,000 somewhere else. So it was removed, but here you see they had another problem, which was that the relationship between the museum mass and the mass of the library was completely unresolved. I mean, the two forms had no connection to each other. And I think what had happened here was that the way that Stanford White saved that $100,000 was that he had value engineered the daylights out of what was going to go on the top of that museum. At any rate, everybody recognized that this was a problem that needed to be addressed, and there's this photograph showing some full-scale mock-ups of different approaches. On the left you have a balustrade with a Greek pattern, which was similar to the pattern White had used on the interior of the rotunda. In the middle you have the balustrade in this sort of Italian Renaissance pattern, which was McKim's favorite design for balusters. And then on the far right you see these columns, square columns supporting a roof that would go as a kind of ambulatory around the back of the museum. Now, I think that is what it had been designed all along, and I think Stanford White cut that out to save his $100,000, and when everybody saw this, they put it right back so that the cost went up again. But you would have to agree that it was, in fact, absolutely the right decision, that this ambulatory and colonnade has sort of a combination of sort of transparency, sort of permeability, and enclosure. It really does work both ways. And once it was up, McCracken realized that this was an opportunity that nobody had thought about, and he basically invented the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, in which busts of great Americans would be placed in the spaces between those columns. This preceded the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown by 40 years, so this was the very first. Well, the next letter that shows up in the McCracken archives is quite surprising, and I'm actually going to read it to you. If you could say, you should, of course, be very happy to consult with Mr. Tiffany or anyone else that you or the committee desire about the color of the glass to be used in the iron grills or any detail about the building. But we beg that you will kindly consult us first and that we ourselves be allowed to call them in, as any other action necessarily places us in an unpleasant position. Well, White has his back way, way up in this letter, and it's a little strange at a number of levels. I think that Tiffany was introduced to this project by Helen Gould. She had done a number of commissions with Tiffany earlier, and so they had a relationship, and she probably felt that he would bring value added to the interior design. It's also unusual in the date, January 1898. This building has been under construction for 2.5 years now when they bring in the decorator. And lastly, it's unusual because White and Tiffany went back a long way and had an extremely good working relationship. White had joined Tiffany and the associated artists, Lockwood DeForest, Candace Wheeler, and Samuel Coleman in the design of the room that I'm talking to you from, the Veterans Room at the 7th Regiment Armory, really one of the greatest, if not the greatest, aesthetic movement room in America. White and Tiffany also collaborated at this very time that White was working on the Armory. The firm McKim White was working with Tiffany's father, Charles Lewis Tiffany, on the design of a 3-family house at the corner of 72nd Street and Madison Avenue that would accommodate Charles Lewis and his wife, their married daughter and her children, and then up in the attic behind that Palladian window that you see, kind of the coolest bachelor pad in New York City for Louis Comfort Tiffany. This was must have been a wonderful, wonderful space, and it's a shame that it is no longer there. White and Tiffany collaborated further. There's a house down in Baltimore called the Garrett Jacobs House, where at the top of that wonderful circular staircase, there is this monumental stained glass dome designed by Tiffany Studios, and then over the front door, there's this 3-panel stained glass window by Tiffany, probably celebrating the Spanish conquest of the Americas, I mean, based on the pantaloons that the figure in the middle is wearing. Anyway, they went way back, and White should have been happy to have the opportunity to collaborate with Tiffany. I think he was standing on principle on this one. There's a letter from Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company to Henry McCracken saying, we've been asked by McKim White to submit prices for the work on the interiors, and we will do that henceforth. What has changed, though, what's interesting is that between the time of the groovy bachelor pad in the very, very early 1880s and now, this is 1896, 98 actually, Tiffany had really had become a brand. I mean, he was now a big, big business. He was traveling all over the country. He had a lot of staff, and in fact, of all the letters to McCracken in the McCracken archives at NYU from Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, not a single letter is signed by Louis Comfort Tiffany himself. They're always signed by one of his employees, who invariably adds, sort of near the bottom, I discussed this with Mr. Tiffany as he was getting on the train. So Tiffany knew what was going on, but it was just a different Louis Comfort Tiffany than White had collaborated with before. Well, Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company was highly professional. They produced lots of estimates and proposals for every single element in the building. And I think if you look at the building, though, and look at the record, what you're missing is a record of an artistic collaboration. It's a very business-like collaboration, but you don't know if they ever discussed the color or the color of the gold leaf or the color of the paint or any particular special treatment. That's completely missing, and yet it must have taken place. It's just a tragedy that we It may have been conversational rather than something that was done on the record. But I think if you look at this, you will conclude that the shapes of things were designed by the architect. I mean, anything with a physical shape came out of the McKim White office, whereas the finish that was applied to that shape came from Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, and to what extent it was a collaboration in the case of painting and paint colors, I don't know. But in terms of the mosaics, I think Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company probably had a pretty free hand in this, and I must have had a completely free hand in the design of the stained glass windows that really bring those spaces to life. Well, while the interiors were getting hashed out, another problem between McCracken and White sort of comes up, and this has to do with that staircase leading up to the reading room. McCracken complains to White that the staircase is too narrow, too long, and too steep. And of course, there's nothing White can do about this because this building is now practically completed. So White responds by appealing, I think, to McCracken's self-esteem as an academic. And he explains that this staircase that he's designed is based on the design of two unimpeachable staircases. One is the Scala d'Oro in the Doge's Palace in Venice, and the other is the Scala Regia in the Vatican in Rome. And that the staircase that he, Stanford White, has designed is wider, shorter, and shallower than either of those staircases. Well, McCracken had to accept this because there was nothing he could do about it, and the subject doesn't come up again. But what White didn't say was that he actually knew what he was doing. White really believed in the reading of architecture through a processional sequence that included moments of compression followed by moments of release, the sort of spatial impact. And when you look at the staircase at the Gould Memorial Library leading up to that door, yes, it's long, it's steep, and it's pretty narrow. But that's the point. You get to the top of the staircase, you're slightly out of breath, and then you go through those doors that are straight ahead of you. And every single person who has done that for the first time just takes a deep, deep gasp for breath, because this is what you come into. This is the release from the compression. This is what Stanford White was aiming for, and it had nothing to do with the Scala d'Oro or the Scala Regia. This was kind of Stanford White at the top of his game. Well, the building did get finished, and this is a picture of the groundbreaking. It's sort of a wonderful, sort of almost candid journalistic photo of people all over the place, very excited about the opening of this new library. And what I think is great is that this is exactly practically the minute that the screenwriters at 20th Century Fox in Hollywood in 1955 chose for a scene to advance the plot of a movie called The Girl on the Red Velvet Swing, which was starring Ray Milland as Stanford White, Frances Fuller as Bessie White, my great-grandmother, and Joan Collins as Big Trouble Evelyn Nesbit. Well, in this scene, which is, there's a screenshot here, and you can see it was a CinemaScope movie. What you're looking at is an actor in the foreground, a lot of extras in the middle ground, and then a painted set in the background. That was just painted directly onto canvas. And so, of course, buildings don't move, so that was fine, and the extras would agitate a little bit, and so that gave this life. In this scene in the movie, Stanford White arrives for the ribbon cutting by carriage. Evelyn Nesbit arrives in another carriage. They're introduced by mutual friends, and the rest is history. Well, that actually isn't how it happened at all, but it makes the movie go forward, and so it works for them. What I like about this particular view, first of all, is that the costume designers at 20th Century Fox certainly got the academic gown down absolutely right. That's McCracken in the foreground. But what's even more interesting is that the scene itself is taken from a larger image, that the location scouts at 20th Century Fox didn't have to go any closer or any further than the nearest postcard shop to pick up that scene, which they took, sort of cut out with scissors and then handed to the scene painters to enlarge considerably. At this point, the Hall of Fame was one of the most popular tourist destinations in New York, and so it had its own postcard. Well, with the building finished, the university opens. And you can see a couple of people standing on the steps. You see the plants have just been planted, and the Hall of Fame is in the background with no statues in it yet. But they're up and running. And anybody who's done an architectural project like this knows that these projects, when construction is finished, they tend to have a bit of an administrative tail. And again, Gould is no exception. That there's a lot of sort of accounting that's done in which they record the cost of everything from professional services to pencil sharpeners. And then there is a summary in which they say that the cost of the building was $1.1 million and that the Gould family had given all but $8,000 of this. It was really a home run for McKracken. But there are letters in the file, sort of post-construction letters, that suggest that the cordial relationship between McKracken and Stanford White is starting to fray, which is not surprising. I mean, these projects take a toll on you, and this one's been going on for a number of years. So one example of this is a letter from Stanford White to McKracken saying, you know, you haven't paid us for 10 months, so please send us a check. Much more interesting is a letter from McKracken to Stanford White, and I'll take a minute to go over this. I mean, the scene, I can imagine Stanford White, McKracken dictating this letter so as he's pacing back and forth in his office and getting more and more agitated. But it starts off saying that he's enclosing a bill for repairing a skylight, and he wants McKim White to pay this bill. And then he goes on to say that this is the third time the skylight has needed repair. He's paid the first two, and he's not going to pay the third. And then getting even more warmed up, he said, you know, nobody ever wanted this skylight. You were the only one. The contractor thought it was a bad idea. I couldn't believe you were putting a skylight over books in the library, but this was your skylight. You own it, and you fix it. And then he gets to the second page where he is really ripping, and he says, you know, this project has been going on for a long time, and I have put a lot of my own time into it. And in the course of this, there were a lot of really bad ideas that you had that I prevented you from doing. And then there were a lot of really good ideas that I had, which I insisted that you do. And as a result, this is a very much better building than it would have been if you had done it on your own. And then with that off his chest, he starts to calm down, and he says, however, you know, it's a great success, and you should really take all the glory that accrues to you for this and just pay the enclosed bill. Well, it was a great success. It was, this building gave NYU this sort of instant credibility as a major university, both as a teaching facility and as even here as a sort of a setting for academic life, including academic life at its most formal and processional. They don't have academic processions like this anymore, particularly with women in white gowns blowing trumpets. I think you have to dig pretty deep in the file to find that. But the college is a success, and the Hall of Fame starts to fill up with busts of great Americans. They were, as you can well imagine, for the most part, dead, white, and male. That will be corrected eventually. It's just not so cheap to make those bronze busts anymore, but it needs to more fairly reflect, I think, the contributions of Americans. The Hall of Fame had brand extension too. This you could buy at Bloomingdale Brothers then. I suspect you can't buy it now, but I would love to come across a bottle of Hall of Fame, even just to find out how it tasted. Well, life up at the at the university must have been successful, because about 15 years later, 20 years later, the university contacts McKim White again to update the master plan for the university. And what they produced was this kind of Brobdingnagian solution to expanding the university. The Gould Memorial Library is still in the lower right, but it's got a mirror image in the center up at the top. It's got an even bigger building off to the right, and then there's a building with a campanile off to the left. So this was thinking big. The co-architect on this was a man named Fisk Kimball. He was listed as a university architect. Fisk Kimball was, he was an architect. He started the architecture school at the University of Virginia, and then he came up to NYU, where he was the university architect. He had, in addition to input on this design, he had a kind of a side gig, or at least a small idea, which was that at the very time this was being developed, Madison Square Garden, the great building designed by Stanford White at 26th Street and Madison Avenue, which was a complete financial disaster, was about to be torn down. And Stanford White, at this point, had been dead for 15 years, but Fisk Kimball knew that the Diana at the very top of the Madison Square Garden would come down with the rest of the building. And so he made an arrangement with the owner of the building, the New York Life Insurance Company, that they would give the Diana to New York University and Fisk Kimball would find an appropriate place for it. Well, the problem was the Depression came and those great plans for the expansion of the University Heights campus never happened. And then Fisk Kimball himself changed jobs. He moved down to Philadelphia, where he became the first director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And that explains why Diana from 26th Street and Madison Avenue sits now at the top of the staircase of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I had always wondered how it got there, and that's the story. Well, McKim White had one more sort of intersection with the campus, which was in the late 20s. Larry White, who appeared in that picture of McKim, Mead, and White's in the country as a 12-year-old, is now in his 30s, and he is a partner in the firm of McKim, Mead, and White. He designs those doors on the right to be a tribute to his father. They're the Stanford White Memorial doors. He gets White's friends to raise the money to have them cast. He gets the artist with whom White collaborated to contribute those bas-reliefs. They're a beautiful set of doors, and that is appropriately how you get into this museum now. Well, this is a picture of what happens in the 60s. In the late 1960s, somebody threw a Molotov cocktail into the chapel, and with the result that it damaged the interior and damaged that Tiffany stained glass window that you see in the background, which was considered to be unsalvageable. Things had been pretty bad before the Molotov cocktail arrived. The Bronx was becoming a less desirable place to have a college. People didn't want to go up there to go to college. The student unrest in the late 60s regarding the Vietnam War was making life on all campuses pretty untenable. And NYU was getting more and more discouraged. And finally, in 1972, NYU bails out of the Bronx. They go down to Greenwich Village. The city buys the campus for $60 million and gives it to Bronx Community College, which is one of 25 campuses of the city university system. It's the most accessible rung on that educational ladder, and it's an incredibly important institution for the sort of the social ecology of New York, because this is the college where people who have sort of minimum wage jobs and possibly not even a high school diploma can get their high school diploma. They then get a 2-year degree that gives them a skill that allows them to have a career and enter the middle class. So this is really where the kind of the engine of New York works, I think, at one of its most important levels. Well, the Bronx Community College made one significant intervention to the campus, which you see on the right there. It's called North Hall. It's the library designed by Robert A.M. Stern architects, and it's really a brilliant work of architecture at a number of reasons. It closes off that quadrangle and frames it really handsomely. It follows the architectural idiom sort of and ground rules set up by Stanford White. So it's a work of, I think, not only ingenuity, but great modesty as well. You know, in the 60s, NYU hired Marcel Breuer to do a number of buildings, and while those buildings, I think, are quite interesting, they are very poor examples of contextual architecture. Stern here recognized that there were rules that would be beneficial to everyone who used the campus. Well, the library is a interior and exterior landmark at a city, state, and national level, and it continues to be this foreground element that animates the entire campus, but it's an element in distress. The copper is now over 100 years old. You can see it's badly deteriorated. The books disappeared, in '72 when NYU pulled out, but you can see not only these vacant stack spaces, but also water damage as well. And a group of us preservation people and architects got together and created the Committee to Save Gould Memorial Library, which is really kind of an advisory, an advocacy committee, and we are helping Bronx Community College really keep the focus on bringing this building back to life. It is significantly underused. It not only has those physical problems, but there's no program for it at the moment. And we were able to get David Dunlap to do a wonderful article in the New York Times. We were able to get the Preservation League of the State of New York to put it on their 7 to Save list. And the Preservation League introduced us to the Thompson Family Foundation, the foundation that has been so generous to the Armory, was exceptionally generous to us and gave us the money that allowed us to commission a significant existing conditions study for the restoration and adaptive reuse of Gould Library. And the conclusion of that was that in hard costs, hard dollars, March 2018 dollars, it would cost $56 million to restore and transform Gould into an operating academic facility. Now, if you add escalation on soft costs, you're talking about something in the range of a $100 million project. Well, nobody's going to write the check for that, but the good news is that it doesn't have to be a single check. We're chipping away at this. The city and state contributed $12 million to replace the copper on the dome. That's a project that is currently in construction right now. It's in the samples and mock-up stage. The next step is to find approximately $10 million, probably from public sources, to install an elevator in the building to make the building handicapped accessible at all the levels. That great staircase that is white compared to the Scala Regia makes that building completely inaccessible, and you just can't have a public building that you can't get into. One of the members of our committee commissioned this rendering, which shows the Oculus reopened for the first time in about 50 years. It shows the bookcase walls behind the columns turned into glass walls with views into offices, and it shows the floor sort of populated by people happily going about their business. The only problem is we just have no idea what that business is. But we are determined to bring this building back to life. I think it shows the kind of the power of great architecture, the resiliency of great architecture, and it's an example of a building that has such a colorful past really needing a brilliant future as well. Thank you very much.